Hello there. Welcome to this evening's Vodcast. Tonight we're going to be looking at how this changes from a couple of battles, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, into an all-out war. And we call this war the Revolutionary War. As we learned about earlier, revolutionary means something brand new. And that's what this war, the Patriots' hope, brings about, is a brand new country. Other people also refer to this as the War for Independence. So you might hear it some other ways, but we're going to refer to it as the Revolutionary War or the American Revolution. Next slide. The first thing that you need for a war, obviously, is an army. And as you read about a couple of weeks ago, the Continental Congress let each state create a militia, which are small groups of ordinary citizens who want to fight in the war. But while these ordinary citizens might be good for a couple of battles or some small encounters, they're not really going to make it for an entire war. In order to do that, they need an army. And so the Continental Congress begins recruiting men. At this point, it's just men. Sorry, ladies, I know that you would love to have helped out in this battle, and we're going to find later that they do, but they're not recruited as soldiers. The men enlist for 6 months, so that means they sign up to fight for 6 months, and they are paid for that service with new money. The Continental Congress is printing American money. Much different from what we know it as today, but it's no longer the British pound. And men of all ages join the army. Most of them are poor farmers. They were hit hard with the taxes, and they have the most reason to fight against Britain. So they leave their farms. Maybe they leave them in control with their slaves, if they had slaves. Maybe it's with their sons or daughters, but they leave these farms and travel with the army. And they would receive 2 weeks of training from a general or from another soldier, and then they would join the battles. I want you to answer in your notebook, do you think 2 weeks of training is a lot of time? Do you think the training 2 weeks is a lot of time? Next slide. In addition to creating an army, they now need to provide for the army. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago with the British, every army needs basic supplies like guns, bullets, uniforms, food, shelter, things like that. And since the Americans had never had an army before, they didn't really have any of these supplies. So they all needed to come from scratch. And so the Continental Congress encouraged patriots to help and share whatever they could. They said, if you have any extra food and soldiers are nearby, please share it with them. If you have any extra clothing, if you have any extra supplies, please pass it along. They need all the help that they can get. The soldiers were also given money to get these things, but some of the merchants, the shopkeepers, would not accept this new American money. They would go up to buy these things, and the merchants would say, sorry, we only accept British money. We don't accept that money. And so the soldiers had a hard time buying some of their goods. I want you to answer in your notebook, why do you think the merchants would not accept the American money? Why would they only accept British money? Because of this lack of supplies, many soldiers end up dying. The winters were extremely cold, 10, 15 degrees, colder than anything that you would experience in San Francisco. And these soldiers were just wearing T-shirts and maybe a pair of boots if they were lucky. So many of them died from the cold weather, and many of them died from lack of food. They didn't have enough to eat, and as they were marching hundreds of miles, their bodies would just shut down. It's really tragic. Next slide. So now we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses for the Americans and then for the British. As you can see, the strengths are on the left and the weaknesses are on the right. The Americans knew the land better than anyone else. They had lived there. They'd spent their whole lives there. They knew all of the woods. They knew all the paths. They could get around anywhere, night or day. It didn't matter. They also introduced a new fighting style, which we call guerrilla warfare. Back in those days, when you went to battle, the soldiers basically formed straight lines facing each other, and someone would yell, "Fire!" And you would fire as quickly and accurately as you could. And what that led to was the army with the better weapons that could travel farther and more people usually won. The Americans know that they have no chance to win in this style of fighting. So they create this new style called guerrilla warfare. And they would hide in the bushes, they would hide in the trees, and when their opposition was going by, they would surprise them and attack them. And the British never adapted to this. They were used to marching up in their straight lines with someone playing the drums and everyone, yelling fire. As many of you mentioned in the debate, the Americans also had the heart and the desire. They were willing to win at any cost. And as you guys know, when you really, really, really want something, you find a way to make it happen. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the Americans had a better strategy. Their leaders, although they were young and inexperienced, they were willing to think differently than the British and came up with much better strategies than the British were using. While those are great strengths, their weaknesses were pretty daunting. As we said earlier, they had no supplies. It's kind of hard. You could have all the heart in the world, but if you don't have a musket or a bullet, it's pretty hard to fight. Their soldiers had no formal training, so they kind of were just given a weapon and told, okay, go in there and fight. They didn't have enough soldiers. Britain had a lot more soldiers than they did. And the leaders for the Americans were very inexperienced. For most of them, this was their first time ever leading other soldiers. I want you to choose one strength that you think will help the Americans more than any other, and one weakness which will hurt them more than any other, and explain why. Next slide. Here are some strengths and weaknesses for the British. Again, their strengths are on the left. They had an infinite supplies and soldiers, meaning they never had to worry about running out of weapons or guns or uniforms or food or soldiers. Whatever they needed, they could get easily. Their soldiers were some of the best trained in the world. They had spent years training and fighting, as opposed to the Americans who only spent a few weeks. Their leaders were experienced. They had led many battles and wars before, so they knew what they were doing. And they end up teaming up with the Native Americans. So it's not just the British, but it's the British and the natives against the Americans. Some of their weaknesses were that most people in Britain, including a lot of the soldiers, thought this was a pointless war. They did not understand why it was such a big deal for the Americans to stay as British citizens. Most of them, in fact, considered the Americans to be their own country because they were so far away. They said, what's the point of keeping these guys here? It doesn't really make any sense. It ends up being a very expensive war, just like the French and Indian War. This costs a lot of money to send soldiers to thousands of miles away, to send all of their supplies. It ends up costing a lot of money. This was also foreign territory for the soldiers. Many of them had never been to America, so they were being asked to fight at lands that they had never seen before. They were not prepared for the weather. They were not prepared for the terrain. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. And Their strategy, as we said earlier, was just bad. They were fighting a traditional war, and the Americans weren't. So we're going to see throughout the war that the British leaders make many strategical mistakes that end up costing the British the Revolutionary War. Next slide. Your final assignment for today is to pretend that you are having a conversation with your friend on August 2nd, 1776. The two of you are comparing the strengths and weaknesses for both sides. Your friend asks you which side you think will win. In a one-paragraph essay, explain which side you think will win and why. So you're only looking at those strengths and weaknesses, and out of that, choose a side that you think is going to win the war. Good luck on tonight's assignment, and remember, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.